Chapter 1. The Assignment. The council had sent me a letter. It was very polite. It used the word opportunity 4 times and the phrase unique interpersonal challenge twice, which in my experience meant the job was impossible and nobody else wanted it. Improve the king's public warmth. That was the assignment. 5 words. I'd read them on the road, sitting in the back of a cart between a crate of turnips and a goat who had strong opinions about personal space. I'd read them again in the courtyard of Greywood Castle, which rose from the mountains like something the Rock had grudgingly agreed to, all gray stone and sharp angles and the architectural warmth of a headache. And now I was reading them a 3rd time, standing in the throne room, because the king was staring at me, and I needed something to look at that wasn't his face. King Brennan Marsh was enormous. Not just tall. Tall was a measurement, a fact you could file away. Brennan Marsh was a presence, the kind of man who made a room smaller just by being in it. He had dark hair, a jaw that could have been used to break rocks, and eyes the color of winter. He was standing behind a massive oak desk with his arms folded, radiating displeasure with such intensity that the air around him seemed to have dropped several degrees. His scent hit me before he spoke. Pine and cold mountain air, and something underneath. Something dark and warm that didn't match the rest of him at all, like finding a hearth burning inside a glacier. My wolf side, the dry, logical voice that lived behind my eyes and watched my life with the detached skepticism of a theater critic at a bad play, noted it with unusual interest. That's specific. File that under irrelevant, but noted. You, he said, are the festival organizer. Iris Wynne, I said brightly, extending my hand. Wonderful to meet you, Your Majesty. I've heard so much about... This isn't going to work. He said it the way someone says it's going to rain. Not with malice, not with anger, just with the bone-deep weariness of a man who has already lived through this conversation in his head and found it pointless. He didn't look at my hand. He looked at the folder I was carrying, at the cheerful blue ribbon I'd tied around it, and his expression was the expression of a man watching a small bird fly into a window. I don't need a warmth consultant, he said. I am not cold. I am efficient. The council has confused the two, and I don't have the energy to correct them again. My hand was still extended. I did not lower it. Thank you for sharing, I said. That is excellent feedback. He stared at me. It was the stare of a man who had just realized that the small bird had bounced off the window, righted itself, and was coming back for another pass. He didn't shake your hand, my wolf observed. On a professional level, that's a concerning start. On a statistical level, it's exactly what the council warned you about. On a personal level, and I want to be clear that I'm noting this for the record and not because it matters. His scent is doing something interesting, and you should stop breathing so deeply. I was not breathing deeply. I was breathing at a perfectly normal rate for a woman whose new employer had just dismissed her existence with the enthusiasm of a man declining a second helping of something he hadn't wanted in the first place. The council has retained me for 6 months, I continued, as if he hadn't spoken. I'll be reviewing your public appearances, diplomatic protocols, and general approachability. I've brought a preliminary assessment framework and a suggested schedule for... Please leave it on the desk. He turned back to his papers. Not rudely, exactly, just completely. As if I had already stopped being in the room. I have a trade dispute to resolve, involving actual problems. Weekly progress meetings, which I think you'll find very on the desk, Miss Wynne. Tuesday works best for me, but I'm flexible. I set down the folder, smiled at the back of his head, and left. Behind me, I heard a sound. Low. A long, exhausted exhalation. The sound a mountain would make if it had been asked to participate in a team-building exercise. The King of Greywood had sighed at me. Not growled, sighed, as if my existence was not offensive, but simply, profoundly, cosmically tiring. So, my wolf said dryly, this is going well. The first 3 weeks were a war of attrition, and I was the only one fighting. Brennan attended precisely 0 of the weekly progress meetings. He didn't refuse, he simply wasn't there, in the way a mountain isn't there for your convenience. He left polite one-line notes. Unavailable Tuesday, trade dispute. Then, unavailable this Tuesday also, different trade dispute. Then, with what I suspected was a flicker of dark humor, Tuesdays are cursed. Pick another day. He asked the council once, very calmly, whether my position could be reconsidered. The council sent a formal letter explaining that it could not. He read the letter, looked at me. I happened to be walking past at that exact moment, which was not a coincidence, and said, "I want you to know that this letter has brought me less joy than anything I've received this year, and I once received a tax audit." I said, "That's a wonderful comparison. Very relatable. We should work that energy into your next diplomatic reception. Audiences love self-deprecation." He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at me with the expression of a man who had just realized that the universe was playing a very long, very specific joke at his expense. "Miss Wynne," he said, with the weary patience of someone choosing their words very carefully, "I am not unkind. I am not unreasonable. But I have governed this pack for 8 years without smiling, and no one has died of it. The Greymore Alpha described you as stone-faced and possibly furious last month. Possibly furious, Brennan. That's not a diplomatic assessment. That's a weather warning." It was the first time I used his name. It slipped out. We both heard it. He didn't correct me. He just made that sound again, the long, exhausted exhalation. The sigh of a man who had been asked to move a mountain and had just noticed the mountain had freckles. I was, against all reason, enjoying myself. "You're enjoying this," my wolf noted, with the tone of a physician diagnosing a rare and embarrassing condition. "You're enjoying antagonizing a man who could literally eat you." I want to be clear about how many things are wrong with that sentence. It wasn't enjoyment, exactly. It was recognition. I knew what Brennan Marsh was doing, because I'd spent my whole life watching people do the opposite. He was building walls. I was the girl who'd learned to tear them down, not because I was brave, but because if I didn't make a door, nobody would let me in. My job, as I understood it, was simple. Stand next to the king at public functions and radiate enough warmth that visitors assumed it was coming from him. It was the diplomatic equivalent of standing next to a bonfire, so people thought you were hot. And it was working. The Greymore Alpha, at a recent summit, had said, "Your king seems much happier these days." Brennan was not happier. Brennan was being mildly tortured by my presence. But the world didn't need to know that. What the world also didn't need to know was that Brennan Marsh, when he thought no one was watching, was not the man he pretended to be. I found this out by accident, the way you find out most of the things that ruin you. I was walking through the East Corridor after midnight. I'd been rearranging the library, a project that would later be described as a crime against chronology, when I heard a voice. Low, quiet, coming from the kitchens. I crept to the doorway and looked in. Brennan was sitting on the kitchen floor, not on a chair, on the stone floor, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his boots off, his feet in thick wool socks. And in his lap, eating scraps of roast chicken from his hand, was the castle's most miserable cat, a one-eared, battle-scarred creature named Sergeant who had never, in living memory, allowed a human to touch him. Brennan was feeding the cat with a gentleness that didn't match a single thing about him. His face in the candlelight was unguarded, soft. The scowl was gone, and without it he looked younger and tired and quietly kind. And I realized with a lurch that the scowl wasn't his face at all. This was his face. The scowl was something he put on over it, every morning, like armor. He was murmuring something to Sergeant that I couldn't hear. The cat was purring so loudly I could feel it in the stone under my feet. I stood in the doorway for too long. I knew I was standing there too long. I should have left after 3 seconds, seen it, filed it, moved on. But I didn't leave, because his hands. The way he held the chicken for the cat. The way his fingers were careful around the old scars on Sargent's face. The way his thumb rubbed the spot behind the remaining ear with a slow, absent patience that suggested he'd done this before, many times, alone, in the dark, where no one would see him being gentle. I went back to the library. I rearranged 3 more shelves. I shelved Tactical Advances of the Northern Campaign next to The Duke's Reluctant Bride, and didn't notice until I'd already moved on. I went to bed and stared at the ceiling, and thought about absolutely nothing, and especially not his hands. Chapter 2. The Falling. Midnight corridor is that you'd falling is that you don't feel it happening. You feel the ground afterward. I organized a breakfast gathering for the castle staff, name cards, assigned seating, bread and cheese and fruit. I set myself a place between Gareth the guard and one of the kitchen assistants. The staff arrived, they sat, they ate, they talked. Gareth put his coat on my chair. The kitchen assistant moved it to sit with her friend. My name card got knocked to the floor. Neither of them saw it happen. I stood at the edge of the room holding a pitcher and watched my own seat disappear. This was fine. People rearranged seats. I kept smiling. I circled the room, refilling cups, being bright and useful and everywhere at once. Everyone agreed it had been a wonderful idea. Nobody asked why I hadn't sat down. I cleaned up alone, picked my name card off the floor where it had been stepped on. The ink was smudged. I put it in my pocket because throwing it away felt like agreeing with it. I didn't know Brennan had seen any of this. I didn't know he'd stopped in the corridor on his way to a meeting and watched the whole thing. The chair taken, the name card kicked, the smiling, the cleaning up alone. I didn't know until much later, when he told me what he'd understood. "You were invisible," he said, "and you just kept going." I think that was the moment something in him stopped fighting me. Not because I was bright, because I wasn't. I calve that, things changed. Not dramatically. Brennan didn't suddenly become warm or talkative or pleasant. He was still Brennan. He still sighed when I entered a room. He still looked at the yellow tablecloths I'd installed for a visiting trade delegation and said, "It looks like a field of weeds has exploded." And I still said, "Dandelions are weeds to some, wishes to others." And he still turned and stalked out. But this time, in the doorway, he paused. Just for a second. He didn't turn around, he just stopped. And the corner of his mouth did something. I almost missed it. The smallest possible movement, the ghost of a smile, killed so fast that if I'd blinked, I wouldn't have believed it happened. But I didn't blink. I stood in the dining hall afterward, alone, surrounded by buttercup yellow, and my hands were shaking, and I didn't know why. It was a mouth twitch. It was nothing. It was the most nothing thing that had ever happened to anyone, and I was standing there with trembling hands like an idiot because the king had almost smiled at something I'd said, and the room was too bright and too warm, and I needed to sit down. I sat down. On the floor, actually, because the chairs were all on the other side of the table, and I couldn't be bothered to walk around. I sat on the stone floor of the dining hall in a pool of yellow linen and pressed my hands to my face and breathed. This was a job. This was a job. This was a job. I wasn't convincing anyone, least of all myself. After that, I started noticing things I shouldn't have been noticing. The way he stood in doorways, not blocking them, but filling them, his shoulder against the frame, his body angled into whatever room I was in. The way he'd ask questions about my plans that he pretended were challenges, but were actually curiosity. The way he'd leave a room I was in and then come back 4 minutes later for something he'd forgotten. And the something was always near wherever I was standing. He was orbiting me. Slowly, reluctantly, the way a planet orbits a sun it hasn't agreed to be gravitationally bound to. Then one afternoon, I was explaining my cultural goodwill initiative to the council, the part about the sock pageant. He laughed. Just once. A short, sharp, involuntary bark of sound that he smothered so fast with a cough that half the council missed it. But I didn't miss it. I heard it, and the sound went through me like a bell, and I carried it around for days. I'd be doing something completely unrelated, reviewing trade documents, arguing with the cook about soup, and I'd hear that laugh again in my head, and my stomach would do a slow, warm flip, and I'd lose my train of thought and have to start over. Allergies, he'd said, when the counsel stared at him. He didn't have allergies. He had me. And then, and this is the one that finished me, we were standing side by side at his desk reviewing a guest list, and I reached for the same parchment he did. Our fingers touched. It was nothing, a fraction of a second, the lightest possible collision of skin on skin. But neither of us moved. For one held breath, our fingers rested on the same piece of paper. And the silence in the room changed from the silence of two people working to the silence of two people who have realized something they can't take back. He pulled away first. And then he did the thing that kept me awake. He looked at his own hand. He held it in front of him and stared at his fingers, the ones that had touched mine, with an expression of confusion and something like wonder, as if his hand had done something without his permission, and he wasn't sure whether to punish it or thank it. He didn't know I was watching. He never knew when I was watching. But I was always watching. And the way he looked at his own hand in that moment, baffled and scared and curious, was the most intimate thing I had ever seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I knitted instead. I was a nervous knitter. My hands needed to be doing something or my brain would eat itself. I made a sock. A tiny, absurd individual sock, no bigger than my thumb, striped in blue and green because he complained about the castle's drafts that morning, and I'd said, "Even your toes?" And he'd said, "Especially the small one." And it had been such a human thing to say, such a specific, silly, unkingly complaint, that I'd been ambushed by a wave of tenderness so fierce I'd had to leave the room. The sock was for his smallest toe. It was not a professional deliverable. It was a joke, except it wasn't, and I knew it wasn't, and my wolf knew it wasn't. "That is a love letter written in wool," my wolf said, watching me finish the last stitch. I put the sock on his desk the next morning, tucked between two trade documents, with a note that said, "For the small one." I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. I found out later that he'd opened his desk drawer, looked at the sock for a long time, and put it inside. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't laughed. He'd kept it in his desk, where he could see it every time he opened the drawer. He kept it, and he didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. And the fact of that tiny sock sitting in his desk drawer in the dark was the quietest, most devastating thing that had ever happened between two people who were pretending nothing was happening at all. I had ever on a Tuesday. I was in the library, committing what Brennan would later describe as an act of organizational terrorism when he appeared in the doorway. He'd stopped lurking. At some point in the last month, he'd started seeking me out, not to argue exactly, but to be near me while pretending he was there for other reasons. He'd lean against a door frame and ask about the schedule, or question my color-coding system, or simply stand in companionable silence while I worked. He probably didn't realize he was doing it. His wolf knew. "The Silvercrest pack has accepted our invitation," he said, his voice flat. "They arrive in 2 weeks." I put down the book I was holding. "The Iron Ore Treaty? Brennan, that's wonderful. Their deposits could secure our blacksmiths for a generation." He blinked. It was the first time I'd used his name without his title, and we both heard it. "You just called the king by his first name," my wolf noted. "Professionally, that's a termination event. Personally, I notice you're not correcting yourself." Interesting. Brennan didn't correct me either. Instead, he told me about the Silvercrest pack, the 900-page protocol manual, the soup spoon incident, Alpha Alistair's face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then told a disappointing joke. He told me these things while standing close enough that I could smell him. Pine, cold air, and that dark, warm note underneath that I still hadn't named. And the whole time, his body was angled toward me, like a compass needle that had found north. He didn't know he was doing it. I knew. 2 weeks, I said, already reaching for a notebook, my mind exploding into flowcharts. That's tight but manageable. We'll need bowing rehearsals, menu consultations, seating charts. You've color-coded things, haven't you? I was going to. The color coding is not necessary. The color coding is essential. Iris. My name, just my name, spoken in his low, rough voice, and my stomach did something entirely unprofessional. There it is, my wolf said. The cardiovascular event returns. Should I time them? I feel like they're getting more frequent. Chapter 3. The Night Before. The 2 weeks of Silvercrest preparation were a comedy of escalating disasters and increasing proximity, and both of these things were going to kill me. The bowing rehearsals came first. I assembled 63 wolves in the Great Hall, armed with a protractor and a pointer stick. The Alpha Acknowledgement Bow requires exactly 22 degrees of forward inclination, I announced. Not 21, not 23. The Silvercrest Protocol Manual specifies 22. How will they know? Asked Gareth, a guard who was built like a wardrobe and had the flexibility of one. They have a man whose job it is to know. He's called the Arbiter of Form. He watches posture the way hawks watch mice. The first run-through produced a domino effect when a guard locked his knees, fainted, and toppled into the guard behind him, sending a ripple of collapsing wolves across the hall like the world's slowest avalanche. Brennan watched from the doorway. He said nothing. He turned and left, and I heard his footsteps echoing down the corridor, measured, deliberate, the footsteps of a man going to a private room to either scream or laugh. When I found a protractor on my desk the next morning with a note that said, "Try 12 degrees, less fainting," I stared at it for a full minute. He left you a protractor note, my wolf said. I want you to know that on any objective scale, that is not romantic. And yet here we are, staring at it like it's a sonnet. The bread was next. The Silvercrest preferred a crust that was assertive but not hostile. I spent an afternoon with Rowan the baker, who had been producing excellent bread for 30 years without once being asked to describe its personality. This one, I said, tapping loaf 78. Firm crust but yielding interior. It suggests strength with generosity. It's sourdough, Rowan said. It's diplomatic sourdough. It's sourdough, Iris. Brennan passed through the kitchen during the tasting. He picked up a piece of loaf 78, tasted it, and said, "Adequate." Then, without looking at me, he took a second piece. He took a second piece. He never takes second pieces, my wolf noted. He ate the bread you chose. Twice. This is not nothing. I am reluctantly adjusting my assessment of the situation. The seating chart was where things got dangerous. Green for allies, blue for neutrals, red for grain tariff arguers, purple for Liam. Brennan found me surrounded by parchments and asked why his beta was purple. Because he is going to do something stupid in front of Captain Petrova, and I need to locate him quickly when it happens. He said, "That's actually reasonable." And then he sat down next to me. He sat beside me for 2 hours, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, close enough that every breath brought his scent. Pine, cold air, that dark, warm note that I was beginning to suspect was what desire smelled like when it was being held very tightly under control. We worked in a silence that was no longer cold. It was the silence of two people who had run out of reasons to stay apart and were using a seating chart as an excuse. Every now and then his nostrils would flare and his eyes would half close, and I knew he was breathing me in without meaning to, and every time he'd catch himself and pull back, and his jaw would tighten. The pattern had been there for weeks. First, he'd noticed my scent, then my competence, then my laugh. And each time his body conceded something his mind refused to. He was a man at war with his own instincts, and his instincts were winning. But the human mind was losing. Meanwhile, across the courtyard, Liam was attempting to carry an impractical number of training swords to the armory. He made it 7 steps before the entire stack cascaded to the ground. Anya watched from the training yard. "Your grip is too wide," she said, and walked away. "She's invested in my improvement," Liam told me later, surrounded by scattered swords. "It's really not working," I said. "It is. She noticed my grip." I shook my head. But I understood him perfectly, because wasn't I doing the same thing? Collecting scraps of warmth from a man who rationed them like they were the last food before winter? The night before the Silvercrest delegation arrived, I couldn't sleep. I was standing on the battlements in the dark, wrapped in a coat, staring at the mountains. The stars were brutal, bright and cold, and far too many of them, the sky showing off. I was running through the next day's schedule for the 14th time when I heard footsteps behind me. Brennan. Of course. He came to stand beside me at the wall, not touching, not quite. The distance between us was the width of a hand. I could feel the heat of him, even in the cold air. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." Silence. The wind moved through the mountains, low and steady. "My father was a warm man," he said. I went very still. Brennan didn't talk about his father. The late king was a locked room in a castle full of open doors, and in 2 months of cracking Brennan open, I'd never gotten near this one. "He was charming," Brennan continued, his voice stripped of its usual authority, stripped of everything but the memory. "People loved him. He signed treaties with a laugh and called foreign alphas his brothers. He told me about the Blighted Coast alpha, the week of feasting, the signed treaty, the brotherhood. And then, his voice going flat, he told me about the betrayal, the stolen grain, the sold lumber, the winter of starvation, the 5th of the pack they lost. He told me about watching the light leave his father's eyes. I was 12, he said. He never smiled again, not once." The stars blurred. I blinked, hard. "I swore I would never make that mistake," he said. "I would never let warmth make me vulnerable. I would never be so busy being liked that I forgot to protect the people who depended on me." He turned to look at me, and in the starlight his face was raw, open, unguarded in a way I'd never seen. "And then the council hired a 5'4" festival organizer with freckles and a sock pageant, and she—" He stopped. "She what?" I whispered. "She made me laugh," he said. And the way he said it, it sounded like a confession, like a crime. She made me laugh, and it terrified me, because the last person who made this castle laugh was my father, and it destroyed him. The distance between us had shrunk. I didn't know which of us had moved, maybe both. The width of a hand was now the width of a breath. "Joy isn't weakness, Brennan," I said, "and I'm not a threat." "I know that," he said, his voice rough. "I've known it for weeks. My wolf knew it the first day. It's been furious with me. Every day it's—" He broke off, a harsh laugh escaping him. "It thinks you're the most magnificent thing it's ever encountered, and it has been making my life a living hell because I won't, because I—" He stopped again. His hand was on the stone wall between us. My hand was inches away. "You won't what?" I asked. He looked at me. The king was gone. The scowl was gone. The wall was gone. There was just a man, standing in the dark, looking at me with an expression I'd been waiting 8 weeks to see. "I won't stop pretending I don't want to do this," he said. And then he kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not smooth or practiced or anything close to composed. It was a man who had held himself in check for 8 weeks, finally, catastrophically losing the argument with himself. His hand came up to the side of my face, his fingers sliding into my hair, and his mouth found mine with a kind of desperate precision that made my knees actually, physically buckle. He caught me. Of course he did. His other arm wrapped around my waist and pulled me against him, and he was solid and warm, and his scent was everywhere. Pine and cold air, and that dark, warm thing underneath that I finally understood was want. It was what want smelled like on him, and I was drowning in it. My wolf was, for once, speechless. I kissed him back. I kissed him back with everything I had, with 8 weeks of pretending I wasn't watching him, pretending I didn't care about the almost smiles, pretending the accidental touch hadn't kept me awake for 2 nights. I kissed him, and the world narrowed to the place where his mouth met mine, and for 3 perfect, devastating seconds, nothing else existed. Then he pulled back. Not far. His forehead rested against mine. His breathing was ragged. His hand was still in my hair. "I can't," he whispered. "Not tonight. The Silvercrest. Tomorrow. I can't think clearly when you're—" He exhaled, a shuddering breath. "If I let this happen now, I'll lose myself. And I need to be the king tomorrow." I understood. I hated it, but I understood. "Okay," I said. My voice was steadier than the rest of me. "Tomorrow, you'll be the king. And after?" "After," I said, "you can be whatever you want." He let me go. It looked like it cost him a limb. He stepped back, and the wall between us rebuilt itself, brick by brick. But this time we both knew it was temporary. This time the wall had a door, and we both knew where the key was. He walked away without looking back. I stood on the battlements, alone, the ghost of his mouth still burning on mine, and I pressed my fingers to my lips. "So," my wolf said, finding its voice at last, "still just a job, is it?" I laughed. It came out shaky and bright and completely, ridiculously happy. Chapter 4. The Visit. The Silvercrest pack arrived on a gray afternoon, and everything was different. Not visibly. Visibly, Brennan was the king, stoic, imposing, radiating authority. I stood beside him in my official capacity, clipboard in hand, professional smile locked in place. To anyone watching, we were exactly what we'd always been, the grumpy king and the cheerful advisor. But underneath, the world had shifted on its axis. Every time his hand came to rest on the small of my back, a guiding gesture for the delegation's benefit, I could feel the heat of his palm through my dress, and the memory of last night pulsed between us like a second heartbeat. When he leaned down to murmur a protocol reminder in my ear, his breath ghosted across the place where my neck met my shoulder, and I felt my whole body flush. "He's doing that on purpose," my wolf observed, "the neck thing. He's absolutely doing that on purpose. His wolf is aiming for exactly that spot, and his human brain is pretending it's about protocol. Fascinating. Appalling." Continue. Alpha Alistair was everything Brennan had described. Slate-eyed, granite-faced, grim. His daughter Sophie, 8 years old, stood beside him looking profoundly bored. She had restless eyes that scanned the castle with hungry curiosity, and when she spotted the yellow banners on the ramparts, a flash of delight crossed her face before she smoothed it into Silvercrest blankness. The formal greeting went flawlessly. 17 bows, no fainting, no dominoes. Though I did notice Anya Petrova watching Liam from her guard position with the careful blankness of someone who was absolutely not checking his footwork. Secredator was a masterpiece of tension, and I don't mean the diplomatic kind. The great dining hall had been prepared with excruciating care. Every fork inspected, every goblet angled, every napkin folded. The tablecloths were white. I had conceded the buttercup yellow for this occasion, which Brennan had accepted with something approaching gratitude, or possibly relief, or possibly just the absence of open hostility toward linen. The Silvercrest wolves ate in synchronized silence. They lifted their forks at the same angle. They chewed at the same pace. They set their utensils down between bites with a soft, uniform click that suggested they had rehearsed this since birth. Rowan's diplomatic sourdough was examined, chewed, and set down without comment. The butternut bisque, which I had chosen over safe leek and potato because I believed in ambition, even in soup, disappeared into impassive faces. The meat course followed, substantial but not aggressive, per the protocol manual. So carefully moderate, it had essentially no personality. It was the meat equivalent of beige. I was spiraling. The bisque was too ambitious. Leek and Potato says stable. Butternut says aspirations. They think we want their iron ore too badly. This is a soup-related diplomatic incident. The bread is not hostile, my wolf interjected. The soup is not a political statement. You are projecting your anxiety about the man sitting next to you onto root vegetables. This is beneath us. Because Brennan was right there, right beside me. His thigh was 6 inches from mine under the table. 6 inches. I could feel the heat of him through the space between us, and his scent, pine, cold air, and that dark warm note that I now knew was want, because I'd tasted it on his mouth last night, was doing things to my concentration that should have been illegal in a diplomatic setting. Every time his hand moved, to lift his goblet, to tear bread, to rest on the table between us, I watched those fingers and remembered them in my hair, and my pulse kicked, and I had to stare very hard at my own soup to avoid doing something catastrophic like touching him. He was struggling too. I could see it in the rigid set of his jaw, in the way his fingers gripped his goblet too tightly, in the way his eyes kept drifting toward me and snapping back to Alistair with military discipline. Once, reaching for the bread, his elbow brushed mine. The contact lasted half a second. He inhaled sharply through his nose, and his whole body went taut, and I watched his nostrils flare and his eyes half close, and I knew he was breathing me in without meaning to. His shoulders were locked so tight they were going to give him an injury. Every line of his body was angled toward me, even as his face was aimed at Alistair, like a man staring at a spreadsheet while a sunrise was happening to his left. I had to do something. The silence was going to kill me, and not because of diplomacy. I leaned toward him, close enough that only he could hear, close enough that my lips almost brushed his ear, and whispered, I heard a rumor that the head chef has a tattoo of a turnip on his left buttock. He calls it his muse. Brennan's composure cracked, his jaw twitched, he coughed, and then, thump, 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 a rhythmic beat under the table. His body, that traitorous, wolf-driven body, was doing the thing it did when his instincts overrode his control, a subtle but unmistakable movement against the wooden chair. He was wagging. For me. In front of the entire Silvercrest delegation. The horror on his face was exquisite. Thump. 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 More enthusiastic. Whatever was happening inside him, whatever argument his human mind was having with the part of him that had decided I was worth celebrating in the middle of a formal dinner, the celebrating part was winning. I could see it in his face. The horror fighting with something else, something bright and involuntary, something that looked suspiciously like joy, trying to escape a 20-year prison sentence. Liam choked on his water. Guards found the ceiling fascinating. Is there a draft? Alistair asked. Loose floorboard, Brennan said, his voice strained to structural failure. He kicked my ankle under the table. Hard. I gave Sophie, who was staring under the table with laser focus, the tiniest wink. The ice cracked. Barely, but it cracked. Later, on the battlements, Brennan found me. The night was cold and clear, and the castle spread below us in lantern-lit silence. Somewhere in the guest wing, the Silvercrest wolves were presumably eating a silent, orderly dessert, and not discussing what they had or hadn't heard under the dinner table. A turnip tattoo, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You almost started an international incident over a fictional vegetable tattoo. But you smiled. I did not smile. Your body disagreed, emphatically, rhythmically. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the look he gave me was the look of a man who had lost a war he'd been fighting for 8 weeks and was trying to decide whether to surrender with dignity or just collapse. That has never happened to me before, he said. I have maintained control through ambushes, assassinations, and a council meeting where Elder Greaves talked about grain storage for 4 hours. And tonight, you whisper one sentence about a fictional root vegetable, and my body... He stopped. Swallowed. It was a percussion solo, Iris. A very endearing percussion solo. It was not endearing. Sophie thought it was endearing. Sophie is 8. Her judgment is compromised by a general enthusiasm for chaos. She gets that from her father, apparently. He made a joke today about a tapestry. Brennan looked at me, and the banter fell away. In the moonlight, his face was open in a way I was still learning to recognize. The king stripped back, the scowl set aside, just the man. The man who had kissed me last night on this exact spot. The memory sat between us, vivid and warm. I thought about it all day, he said quietly. During every bow, every handshake, every carefully measured diplomatic silence, I thought about last night. My heart was beating in my throat. So did I. He took a step closer. The distance between us shrank to inches. I could feel the heat of him, could smell pine and cold air, and want. After, he said. The word was thick with restraint. We said after. We said after, I agreed, and it was the hardest word I'd ever spoken. He reached out, slowly, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered against my cheek for a single, devastating second. Then he pulled his hand back, and I watched his jaw tighten as the wall rebuilt itself. Good night, Iris, he said. Good night, Brennan. He walked away. I watched him go, and every step he took felt like something being stretched between us, a cord of heat and want and waiting that was going to snap the moment the Silvercrest wolves left this castle. You are in so much trouble, my wolf said. I was. I really, really was. Day 2 of the Silvercrest visit began with what I had optimistically titled the Cultural Exchange Morning, and what Brennan had more accurately predicted would be an exercise in mutual discomfort. The tour of the castle's historic halls went smoothly until we reached the Hall of Ancestors, where a tapestry depicting the Gloomfang War hung from the east wall. It was an ancient, dramatic piece, showing a fearsome alpha mid-charge, teeth bared, enemies fleeing in all directions. Unfortunately, one of its hooks had come loose overnight, and the tapestry was now hanging at a comical angle that made the fearsome alpha look like he was sliding down a very steep hill with an expression of mild surprise. Sophie giggled. She slapped her hand over her mouth immediately, but it was too late. Alpha Alistair looked at the tapestry. He looked at his daughter. Something moved behind his stone face, tectonic and slow. The Gloomfang Alpha appears to have lost his footing, he observed. It was a joke. Alpha Alistair, the man carved from granite, had made a joke. Dry and quiet and barely there, but real. The castle has a complicated relationship with gravity, I said. We're working on it. The corner of his mouth twitched. Brennan, beside me, was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who had just witnessed a statue blink. 2 stone-faced alphas in the same room, and the tapestry is the one that cracked first, my wolf noted. There's a metaphor in there if you want it. The crafts demonstration was where things got properly interesting. I had arranged for our best weavers and blacksmiths to display their work, strategic, dignified, going perfectly. Then Liam decided to participate. He appeared at the blacksmith station with the confident stride of a man who had never touched a forge in his life. He picked up a hammer, nodded at the Silvercrest delegation with what he clearly believed was casual authority, and swung. He missed the anvil entirely and hit the water bucket, which launched sideways and drenched the leg of a visiting Silvercrest guard. The guard, a woman built like a wardrobe, looked down at her soaked boot. She looked at Liam. The silence was apocalyptic. I was demonstrating, Liam said, with remarkable composure, the importance of hydration in metalwork. Nobody laughed, but Sophie buried her face in her father's arm, shoulders shaking. Anya Petrova walked over from her security post. She picked up the hammer. Without a word, she struck the anvil with a clean, precise blow that rang through the courtyard like a bell. She set the hammer down, looked at Liam, and said, "Elbows in." Then she returned to her post. Liam stood there, damp and destroyed, watching her go with the look of a man who had just seen a religious vision. "She's correcting me in front of foreign dignitaries now," he whispered as I passed. "We're basically courting." "You're basically a puddle she noticed." That afternoon, Sophie found the library. I'd forgotten to lock it. She stood in the doorway, her eyes enormous, staring at the rainbow of spines. Behind her, several silvercrest wolves peered in with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. "What happened to it?" Sophie breathed. "I improved it." "The military history is next to the cookbooks," a silvercrest scholar said faintly, gripping the doorframe as if the room might spin. "They're thematically linked." "They are not thematically linked." "Supply chains," I said firmly. "Both are about supply chains." "They are not about supply chains," my wolf observed. "You filed them together because the covers were the same shade of green. You know this. I know this. We are choosing not to admit this in public." Sophie walked in without asking permission, ran her fingers along the spines, pulled a bright green book from a shelf, and sat down cross-legged on the floor. It was a treatise on agricultural drainage. "This is next to a book of fairy tales," she observed. "Both are about managing what flows where." She considered this with the genuine seriousness of a child who has not yet learned to dismiss things she doesn't immediately understand. "Our library at home is organized by date. The oldest books are at the top where I can't reach them, and everything at the bottom is about tax law." "That's horrible." "It is horrible." I sat down beside her. Something about this child, this serious-faced girl with restless eyes and a smile she kept hidden like contraband, cracked something open in me. I recognized her. A child in a world that valued stillness, who was not still. I told her about my village library, 12 books, all about sheep farming. About going door to door and ending up with romance novels, a mushroom guide, prayer books, and a pamphlet about shoeing horses. About organizing by feeling instead of subject, because the subjects were insane. The romance novels and the prayer books went together, I said, because they were both about wanting something you couldn't see. "It's perfect," Sophie said, and the word came out fierce enough to surprise us both. "You're very strange," she added. It was clearly a compliment. "Thank you. I work at it." Alpha Alistair appeared in the doorway. He looked at the color-coded shelves. He looked at his daughter, sitting happily on the floor with a drainage treatise, talking with more animation than she'd shown in months. "My daughter has not voluntarily opened a book in 2 years, he said slowly. "She finds our library restrictive, everything in its proper place, everything ordered, everything silent." There was something in his voice that wasn't about libraries at all. It was the voice of a father who had built a world to protect his child, and was only now seeing the walls. That evening, Brennan found me in the workspace we shared. Not our shared anything else, just the room where we worked, though the intimacy of calling it ours was not lost on either of us. He was still in his formal clothes, still carrying the weight of the day, but his face was doing something I'd never seen. He looked shaken. Not by crisis, by kindness. "Alistair spoke to me," he said. "He said his daughter laughed more today than in a year. He said their traditions have become a cage, that his pack is so rigid, so controlled, that his own daughter has stopped reading, stopped laughing, stopped being a child." He looked at me, and his eyes were full of something I couldn't name. He said he envied me. He said, "Your advisor sees what I've forgotten, that strength without joy is just a prettier prison." The words hung between us, enormous and quiet. "He's right," I said. "I know." Brennan took a step toward me, and the air between us went tight. The kiss from last night was right there, 3 feet wide, burning, unfinished. "Iris, about last night." "After," I said, because if he touched me now, I was going to come apart, and the Silvercrest wolves were still in the castle, and the treaty was unsigned, and I needed to be the professional for one more day. "You said after." He held my gaze for a long, charged moment. Then he nodded, once, and the restraint in that single nod, the visible effort of a man choosing to wait when everything in him wanted to close the distance, was the most romantic thing I'd ever seen. "He's going to be insufferable when this is over," my wolf said. "His wolf is going to be absolutely unbearable. You know this." I knew. I couldn't wait. Chapter 5. After. Yarn bouncing, water pitcher crash. The treaty negotiations stalled at hour 3. 12% versus 8. 2 immovable objects. Then Sophie burst through the doors chasing a ball of yarn, followed by a yarn-tangled Liam hopping desperately. The yarn bounced off the treaty table, knocked over a water pitcher, and landed in Alistair's lap. Sophie froze. Liam stood wrapped in 20 feet of blue wool, hoping to become invisible. Alistair looked at the yarn. He looked at his daughter. And he laughed. A real, full-bodied, helpless laugh that broke through decades of Silvercrest rigidity like sunlight through stone. "Papa," Sophie whispered, her terror replaced by wonder. Brennan was smiling. The real smile. The one I'd been chasing for 8 weeks. The one he'd been hiding for 20 years. He looked at me across the room, and through the space between us I felt everything. The 8 weeks, the almost smiles, the accidental touch, the kiss on the battlements, the restraint, the waiting, all of it alive and present and enormous. His wolf, that proud, emotional, ridiculous creature that had spent 2 months being told to sit down, was finally standing up. Tall and warm and done apologizing for wanting to be happy. 10%, Alistair said. 10%, Brennan agreed. Anya cut Liam free with her belt knife. "You should stick to diplomacy," she said. "Was that a joke?" he whispered. "No," but she was almost smiling. Sophie found me in the library the morning she left. She was in her traveling clothes, her face composed, her eyes red. "I have to go back to the tax law library," she said. I sat on the floor so we were the same height. "When I was your age," I said, "I thought being invisible was the worst thing that could happen, so I made sure nobody could miss me. I became bright and loud and useful." I paused. "But the thing I didn't know yet was that the right people don't need you to be bright. They just need you to be there." She hugged me. Fierce and sudden and slightly too tight. The hug of a child who'd been holding herself together for too long. "Can I write to you?" she asked. "You'd better. I need to know if the drainage book was any good." It was actually fascinating. I knew it. At the gates, Alistair told Brennan, "We've become rigid, controlled. It kept us safe, but safety without life." He looked at Sophie waving goodbye to Liam. "There should be more yarn." Brennan watched them ride away. I stood beside him, and the distance between us was 0. "It's after," I said. He turned to look at me. The king was there. The authority, the weight of the crown, the responsibility. But so was the man underneath, the one who fed the cat in the dark, the one whose wolf had been begging him for 8 weeks to stop being afraid. "It's after," he agreed. He didn't kiss me this time. He took my hand, slowly, deliberately, lacing his fingers through mine with the careful precision of a man who wanted to make sure I understood that this was not an accident, not an impulse, not something that would be taken back in the morning. "Not here," he said. "Not in public. You deserve better than a spectacle." He led me inside, through the castle, through the halls I had reorganized and the rooms I had brightened, and the spaces I had filled with color and noise and life, until we were in his chambers, the door closed, the world shut out. He turned to face me, and his hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs tracing the line of my cheekbones, and the gentleness of it after weeks of restraint made my chest ache. "I have been trying not to fall in love with you for 8 weeks, he said, his voice low and rough and shaking. "And I have failed for at least 6 of them. And my wolf gave up fighting it on the first day. And it has been furious with me ever since. And it is right to be furious, because you are, Brennan, the most chaotic, disruptive, absurd, wonderful person I have ever." I kissed him. Not like the battlements, not desperate, not stolen. This kiss was a choice, made in the light, with both of us knowing exactly what it meant. His hands slid from my face into my hair. My hands found the front of his shirt and pulled him closer. He made a sound against my mouth, a low, involuntary rumble that vibrated through both of us. And I smiled into the kiss because the King of Greywood was purring, basically, and my wolf was going to have opinions about this for the rest of our lives. His wolf is extremely happy, my wolf observed, its sarcasm thin and failing. Your heart rate is inadvisable. Your decision-making is compromised. I am formally noting my objections and also, I have no objections. Carry on. When we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine, his breathing uneven, his eyes bright, I said, "The tablecloths stay." He laughed, a real laugh, warm and helpless and given freely, and it was the best sound I had ever heard. "The tablecloths stay," he said. We stayed like that for a while, foreheads together, breathing each other in. And the urgency that had driven us for weeks settled into something quieter and deeper. He pulled me to the chair by the fire and we sat, tangled together. And the distance that had been between us for 8 weeks was finally, fully, blessedly, 0. "Can I tell you something?" I said. "You can tell me anything. You have never needed my permission to tell me anything. This has been one of the defining features of our relationship." I almost laughed. Almost. But the thing I needed to say was pressing against my ribs. "The cheerfulness," I said. "It's not all of me. You know that. You saw it, the breakfast, the name card." He went still. "You saw me be invisible in a room full of people and then just keep going. Keep smiling." My voice was smaller than I wanted it to be. That's all I've ever known how to do. And I can't tell anymore where the mask ends and I begin. His arms tightened around me. "Not pity, recognition. Your smile is a wall," he said. "And your scowl is a wall. And we've been hiding behind them. From different things, for the same reason." He pulled back just enough to look at me, and his eyes were bright, and his face was open, and he was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, not because of how he looked, but because of what he was showing me, the man behind the crown, unguarded and choosing to stay that way. "I see you," he said. "Not the cheerful one, not the planner. You. The woman who made a tiny sock for my smallest toe because she thought it was funny, and it was funny, and I kept it because it was the most real thing anyone had ever given me." "You kept the sock?" "It's in my desk drawer." "Brennan, don't make it a thing. It's already a thing. It's a very small thing. It's a very small sock." I laughed, and the laugh was wet and wobbly and entirely ungraceful, and it was the most honest sound I'd made in years. He kissed me again, slow and deliberate, and I kissed him back. And for a long time we just stayed there by the fire, learning what it felt like to be close, without walls, without performance, without armor. His hand traced the line of my jaw. My fingers found the pulse at his throat, steady and strong. We were not rushing. We had waited 8 weeks. We could wait for whatever came next. Later, in the dark, with his arm heavy across my waist, "I won't be the last person to see you," he murmured against my hair. "But I intend to be the most thorough." That was smooth, my wolf admitted. I'll give him that. I fell asleep with his heartbeat against my back and his breath in my hair. And for the first time in my life, I didn't plan tomorrow. Tomorrow could plan itself. Tonight was enough. 6 months later, the ritual of sincere grumbling was held in the great courtyard, and it was, if I do say so myself, magnificent. I had optimized it naturally. Anonymous suggestion boxes, categorized grievance stations, a grand prize for Grievance of the Year. Brennan stood beside me, his hand resting on the back of my neck, his thumb brushing absently over the mark he'd left there 3 months ago. A deliberate, precise, chosen thing that had happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, with no audience and no drama, Just him looking at me over breakfast and saying, "I think it's time, don't you?" And me saying, "It's been time for weeks." And him saying, "I know. I wanted to be sure you knew I was choosing this, not just falling into it." And the whole thing had been so calm and so certain and so Brennan that my wolf had said, "Finally. I've been waiting for this since the sourdough incident." And I'd laughed into his shoulder while he marked me, which was probably not how it was supposed to go, but it was how it went, and it was perfect. The bond hummed between us now, a constant warmth at the base of my skull. I could feel him, not his thoughts, but his weather. Right now he was content, a deep amber glow like banked coals, which was the emotional equivalent of anyone else being wildly, deliriously happy. His wolf was radiating smug satisfaction. His wolf had been radiating smug satisfaction for 3 months straight. His wolf felt it had been right about me from the beginning and wanted this acknowledged. Brennan refused to acknowledge it. This was their ongoing dispute, and I enjoyed it enormously. Through the bond, I felt his thumb trace the mark again, and a shiver of warmth ran down my spine. He did this in public constantly. He probably didn't realize it. His wolf absolutely realized it. Across the courtyard, Liam knocked over his own drink while gesturing at Anya. She caught it. She didn't say anything about his reflexes. She just handed it back, and the tips of her ears were pink. A foreign delegate approached. "Your Majesty, I have a proposal regarding a joint sock pageant initiative." I opened my mouth. Brennan held up a hand. "Don't." "I wasn't going to." "You were going to say it was wonderful." "It is wonderful." He looked at me. The bond hummed. His thumb found the mark again. "I'll let my mate handle the negotiations," he said. "She's the expert on joy." The castle was still drafty. The king was still grumpy. The tablecloths were still yellow. And I was incandescently, ridiculously, perfectly happy. Not because I was the cheerful one. Not because I was useful or bright or impossible to ignore. Because I was seen.